Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we engage in pro-social conversations about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week, Ryan Tsapatsaris is back and joins Elizabeth for a discussion about bullying. Researchers recently found that bullied students admitted to also being bullies. The trend was stronger for gender non-conforming students than for cisgender students. Non-conforming identities were more strongly associated with the perpetration of bullying than the subjection to bullying. Ryan and Elizabeth connect the findings and some interesting aspects of the data set with recent trends, which are that gender non-conformity among Gen Zers has been dropping. We commend these researchers as well as the journals for sharing these findings at a time when it is risky to do so. Hello, and welcome back to the Dissidents Podcast, and welcome back Ryan Tsapatsaris, who's here to talk about an article that he found in Frontiers, so it's publicly available. We'll post the link, about transgender identity and bullying. And so I don't know how to say the author's name. Is it Heino?
I think so, yeah.
Heino et al. This research study was done in Finland, a large sample size, almost 140,000 middle and high school students, and they looked at a lot of questions. It's sort of we do this in the United States too, like a national youth survey every so often, and so these are kind of typical things that kids do in school. And if you're a parent, you send them to school, so you pretty much have agreed to have your kid fill out these national surveys. But again, this one was in Finland, and they were interested in gender identity and bullying. There were a lot of other questions on the survey. And so thanks for sending me this. I appreciate it. It's kind of it's in your wheelhouse, right?
Yep.
We've had you on the podcast before, and these are the kinds of things we've talked about. Harassment, hate, online, bullying. And now this is, I presume this is in-person bullying. There really wasn't, they say that they define bullying as, it was defined in the research study. It's defined as, we say a student is being bullied when another student or group of students say or do nasty things to him or her. It's also bullying when a student is being teased repeatedly in a way that he or she does not like. But it is not bullying when two students of about the same strength quarrel or fight. So that was their definition of bullying. So what made you choose this article when you sent it to me?
I think there was a couple of things, right? I think the sample size is interesting, as you sort of mentioned, right? We do have similar sort of large scale samples in the US, and we can talk about this. I think we'll talk about this later. There's been a recent sort of focus on a couple of those actually. But I was intrigued by the sample size, even though I will admit now I'm not a quantitative scholar, right? And one of the things they mentioned in the article that also caught my interest was the authors are very aware that they're studying Finnish youth, and they mentioned that a lot of the dialogue about gender identity and what have you is very Amerocentric, right? It comes out of the U.S., comes from the U.S., and the research comes from the U.S., right? And as maybe I've mentioned probably in my other, when I was here before, maybe the U.S. and Canada in some ways are, in terms of the medicine side, are looking a bit exceptional in the way they're handling things. Other countries have changed processes, to be simple, that the U.S. hasn't. So there is something interesting about seeing, even as it's interesting to check and look into non-Western stuff. And obviously Finland is a Western country, but just a global perspective was one of the things that interests me, because a lot of my own work is very North American centric, right? At least if not Anglophone, America centric. And I think on top of that, I think the results were interesting, and unexpected. Right. I think that's why I was particularly interested in it. I think maybe I'll just read sort of what the sort of frontispiece result that the authors mentioned, which is that both experiences of being bullied and perpetrating bullying were more commonly reported by transgender youth than by cisgender youth. Among transgender youth, all involvement in bullying was more commonly reported by non-binary youth and then those identifying with the opposite sex, right? So that distinction there, for those, just to be clear, is the distinction between non-binary and transgender, right? Someone who identifies as that's why that language is placed that way. Logistic regression revealed that non-binary identity was more strongly associated with involvement in bullying, followed by opposite sex identity and cisgender identity. And then the final thing is that transgender identities were also more strongly associated with perception of bullying than subjection to bullying, right? And so, I mean, those are sort of, there's a lot there, but what interested me, and you see this in the math data in the paper, was that both non-binary and transgender students are being bullied. That's sort of one of the findings, right? There's a higher percentage among both. And we'll talk about this later as well. I think this is all self-disclosure, right? It's self-reportage. Obviously, that's how the surveys are done, but I think it's just worth mentioning because this also relates to the identification as well, right? And there could be something lost in the survey. Opposite sex identification versus non-binary, right? There's these words, the semantics of it get really fraught, let's say. And so all that to say, the results basically showed that trans and non-binary students were both victims of bullying, but also perpetrators, right? To some extent, and the extent being greater than cis students, right? I already see this getting clipped online as, and then he said trans people and non-binaries are bullies, right? So that's not what the study says, right? It's first of all, it's comparative, and the authors do a lot of work on how they how they understand these findings, but that's sort of why this paper is interesting, right? There's this finding that, which we may expect, minority students are being bullied, like transgender and non-binary, but also there's also some evidence that they may also be bullying. And I think that's, and there's reasons why we don't always talk about that, right? I think we all know what they are, but I do think it's important. This is, as I understand, a well-done study for what it is, preliminary work. And so that is why I sent it to Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. I mean, the best predictor of engaging in bullying is being bullied. And that doesn't matter whether you're cisgender or
right.
or not, right?
Right.
And so and the authors talk about this, that so it's sort of like, well, being bullied doesn't prevent you from ever being a bully, right? It doesn't. So you're not somehow sainted because you're bullied, and so therefore you never engage in that behavior. And that is even true for people who are non-binary, transgender,
right.
So is it right to say non-gender not gender conforming? Like, is that bad language?
No, I mean, so you see gender non-conforming in the literature.
Okay.
And that's definitely, and that's definitely an appropriate term. I mean, that's definitely an appropriate term. I actually prefer that. The other option, honestly, used that I don't love is queer. I think that aligns too many things. It can be useful, but so no, gender non-conforming is perfect because that covers both populations we're discussing, I would argue. It discusses trans and non-binary. And the only reason to make that distinction is because the authors do, and there might be different findings, but yeah, the whole population, I think gender non-conforming is absolutely appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and they do talk about this. They talk about, and there's literature in this in psychology that it's entirely probable, I guess, that people who are bullied are also, and people who are bullying, are engaging in, biased information processing. And I say biased, but biased in a non-conforming way. So we are all, sort of, navigating this complicated world, and especially when we're a teenager, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine that when we're a bully, there's sort of this Dodge's social information processing, kind of theory where, you see something, you perceive threat where there maybe is none. And then you narrow down your choices as to what to do. And maybe people who are bullies, have fewer choices in their toolbox of what to do. And then, of course, we carry on from there, the fallout. And then, of course, that further narrows our options and what we think we see in the world. And I think the same as, when you're a bully, when you've been bullied. And then there's this sort of when you're bullied, you maybe do some withdrawal, right? You feel maybe, you're lonely, you feel outcast, you feel, rejected. And I think, there's sort of this natural tendency to want to fix that problem, right? So this is a signal, it's a signal to us that we're somehow not fit, that we need to do something about, our social situation, right?
Right.
We're driven to connect. And maybe people who are already targets of bullying don't have very good social skills, maybe reach out in ways they think they're reaching out for attention or whatever, and they're doing it in ways that aren't really appropriate. And it becomes this sort of vicious cycle. And they do mention that. So they're not trying to blame the victim here. They do talk about how this might be a little bit of a cycle of maladaptive coping or poorer coping. And again, in both, bullies and the bullied, that are sort of, it's not going well. Their social cognition is maybe not what society expects. That doesn't make it bad or good. It doesn't make it either one. It's just we're all different. I was looking for the way that they asked about gender because I thought this was interesting. So first of all, they asked like basic demographics. So this is on page, what is this on? I don't know.
It's 4, I believe.
So, so the survey, so they asked people sort of basic demographics, one of which was gender. And so they got 49% almost reported they were male, and a little over 50% reported that they were female. And then later in the survey, they asked people about their perceptions of conforming, right? So they said, according to, let's see, they said something about, do you identify? Yeah, so a female sex and perceives themselves as a girl versus opposite sex and perceives them as, and then either non-binary, and that kind of thing. So that was later on in the survey. So they asked them these 2 different questions. And I did wonder about that. Like, if you're a transgender person, are you identifying in the original question? And, I wasn't sure about the way that was.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point because the research the newer research we'll talk about later about identification, I think, ask the question differently. And looking at the way the Hayano et al. Frame the article, their intent, and they justify, it's funny, they justify sort of why they did what Elizabeth is discussing. They talk about how they were trying in that first question to as their phrase is to understand their natal sex, right? The sex that they were identified as, right? That, and it's interesting because because some of the students are younger, they actually asked boy or girl for the younger students and male or female, which I will argue adds a little bit more semantic difficulty to everything we're trying to record. Even though I understand 100% those words are more appropriate for it's age group appropriate. But I will admit, that didn't register, even though I think about these words a lot. I appreciate Elizabeth pointing that out because that didn't register that those questions were separate. And and they do frame it as, what is your perception of self? The lower question, right? And I think that's an interesting, and whereas the research we're going to talk about later, that question can be asked, are you man, woman? And then, it will say queer, gender queer.
The list is like this long.
Right. Yeah. But allowing those 7 options, right, I think it clarifies, though I would argue that second set of surveys struggles from the issue of not locating the original or natal sex. Mm-hmm. So there's an issue that this is a language issue that I see a lot in this scholarship. I think when we met, we actually talked about, there's a paper called Sex in the Census about the Scottish census. And that discusses the importance of the accurate language and clarity. Actually, clarity is more important even than the accurate language. The recipient of your survey should know what you're asking.
Yeah. And I mean, this isn't their fault really, because of course they don't give this, these researchers didn't give this survey, right? It's sort of a national, youth survey.
Right.
So they can't help that. But it did make me wonder, like, if people understood when they answered the first question exactly what was being asked, and then in the second part of the question. And so that kind of that kind of gets into then, I don't know, are you willing to go into the, what did they call the mischievous respondents? My students, I teach, I teach research methods, and I teach psychology. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but I mean, like, regularly, my students say, they dismiss research because one of their reasons for dismissing research is, well, the respondents just lie. They're like, so this research is no good because that's the first thing they say, like, oh, well, what are some reasons why blah, blah, blah. And they'll just say, well, because, respondents lie. And I'm like, why would someone sign up for an hour-long survey? And then, like, lying is actually a lot of work, right? And so but I do think one of and it's interesting because this story came up in exactly this situation where I was like, I don't really think you need to worry that people are signing up for the general social, they're participating in the general social survey in an interview in their home for an hour and then lying, But this one student said, well, we had to do this survey when we were in school, and it kind of made us mad that we had to, we're doing this thing, and we all just colluded to lie, to make stuff up. So I was like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of this. But I said, look here, you weren't doing that in order to deceive the researchers. You were doing that to show off to your friends.
Right.
Like, that was a friend group thing, right? That you all decided, and then you got to, like, high five. This is sort of what we were talking about before with the bullying and stuff. A lot of times people do stuff so that they can high five their friends, not because they care about the target. And I was like, those people didn't care about the survey or the quality of the survey. You were 12,
right.
15, whatever. You didn't care about the quality of the survey. You weren't even thinking about that. You were just thinking about telling your friends that you told them you weighed 500 pounds or whatever.
Right.
And so that's exactly and so I was amazed. I was like, I just heard that story from a student, because I'm always arguing that doesn't happen, hardly ever happens. And if we have a huge sample, it doesn't matter anyway, because it's, But these researchers did find that these kids reported crazy stuff, like being, like, too young, like being 8 years old or being 25 years old or being, BMI less than 10 or greater than 40, reporting. But here was the interesting thing, that a lot of people, I say a lot, more people than you would expect, reported things like being disabilities, like mobility disabilities, poor hearing, these kinds of things. And those people in this survey were also more likely to report being transgender. So they had these, like, what they called mischievous responders. And this is normal. Like, researchers clean up data. You have, you can just tell, like, people answered C through the whole, just like you would on a test. You didn't know the answer. So they just answer the same thing the whole way through. If you had a physical survey where people are filling out bubbles, you can see sometimes they make lines, right? And you're like, okay, well, that's, and you just note on the survey, you say, that it was eliminated. And then every time a researcher writes up a paper, they'll say, for inappropriate responding, 10 participants were removed for inappropriate responding. That can mean all kinds of things. The computer crashes, if they were online. It can be any kinds of things. But in this case, I just thought it was really interesting that, being classified as a mischievous respondent, which was done through these other questions, these weird kinds of questions, reporting being 6 feet tall and, all that kind of stuff, was strongly associated with also reporting transgender identity. And they were talking about how, particularly in light of excessive media coverage, they wondered whether all of these kinds of things, like, oh, I'm disabled and I'm also transgender and I'm all these kinds of things, were maybe sort of what did they say here? A perception in society of gender variant youth are victims rather than active subjects participating in building, the contemporary adolescent community. So it's sort of this victim kind of, it's like cool in a weird kind of way to, have something special about you. And whether that's being like, grossly underweight or, too tall, too short, too old, too young, too fat, too, whatever. And then also transgender. And that relates to another study that was released recently based on FIRE data, right? Mm-hmm. Foundation for Individual Rights and Education data that suggested that the numbers are dropping.
Yeah, now. Sorry, it's based on multiple data sets. FIRE's FIRE, Brown, I believe, and it's Eric Kaufman's work. But it came out of the Center for Heterodox Social Science, and then he wrote a piece up in Unheard about it. So it's three major data sets, and then sociologist Jean Twenge wanted to respond to it, and she actually basically co-signed his data, right? She has a little bit of a conclusion, but at the end of the day, she agrees. And so, sorry, I cut you off before you got to say what the conclusion was, which is that it looks like gender non-conforming identification, at least on surveys, is dropping in the U.S. at the college level, a little bit older than what we were talking about in the study, the Haino et al. Study. Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your. I feel like I stole your thunder there.
Oh no. I mean, because I only saw the headline. I did not read the whole study. I just saw the little, the little blurb. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and I think that, I guess I'm not surprised. Should I be surprised at that? I'm really not.
No. These are the answers to the questions that begin to, in my research, get other people and me in trouble. I'll be very honest with you. And so I before I really have anything to say, I think it's worth mentioning a couple of the bullet points from the executive summary of Kaufman's work, just so people have a better idea of what we're talking about, right? It's called The Decline of Trans and Queer Identity Among Young Americans. Actually, before I even mention the points, he didn't just find a drop in. I want to explain the queer now. I think it's worth going into. So he says trans, and the immediate sort of social media response was there was a graph going around. Let me back up. I apologize. Let me back up. There's been a graph going around on social media that it's I believe from his from his major paper that shows that over 7 years, I think it's like 2016 to 2023, which roughly lines up with the data that FIRE's first. I think that is the FIRE data is the most heavily represented, as Elizabeth mentioned. And it's going around showing that the question of, he's saying that when it's misconstrued on social media, it's saying that trans identification has dropped overall. And scholars, and his actual work is a little more nuanced than that, as is responses, right? And so the reason he talks about trans and queer is because trans first of all, trans is an umbrella identity, right? In this instance, as we were discussing, we can say gender non-conforming, right? Because that will also include non-binary and other, and as Elizabeth mentioned from the FIRE data, there are 7 options like gender, queer, and he talks about, and so all that to say, so what he has also found a decrease in, which is a sexuality side, is the decrease in bisexual identification.
Oh.
Which is very interesting, right? So he splits this into, he has a category he calls BTQ+, which is bisexual, transgender, queer, and plus for all the other sort of gender non-conforming possible identities, right? And so basically, after surging in the 2010s and 2020s, trans and queer identities are in decline among younger Americans. The peak was in 2023, and then has almost halved since from nearly 7% to under 4%. And then like I said, then about the sexuality, the decline in non-heterosexual share is concentrated in the queer or other sexual categories, pansexual, asexual, etc., and to a lesser extent, bisexuality. There's a great piece in Queer Majority about how bisexuals are a larger proportion than usually represented. So I think it's where this is actually more about, like I said, he says BTQ, but the Q plus and the T is really where the real drops are being seen. Now, the balance on that is, from his research, gay and lesbian are relatively stable. Mm. And that, to me, is the most interesting aspect. Tying all those ends together is that. Mm-hmm. it is, I mean, it may be too premature to say students are more likely to identify as straight and heterosexual, but it looks like, in my sort of vague expertise plus this research, it looks like that's where the trend is headed, right? Gays and lesbians aren't de-gaying. They're not becoming, they're not going, they're just not, right? Now, I will admit, some gays and lesbians end up, I don't mean end up, but realize they're transgender potentially, right? On the other hand, some transgender people also realize actually they're gay or lesbian. There's been some major, if you follow this on social media, there's been some people lately who have, both of those things have happened, right? So, but there's just something, I guess I hope this was clear. All that to say that there's a lot happening around this data right now. 2023 looks like a peak. Obviously, it's too soon to really know, but if the graph goes up and then down relatively sharply, and I mean, it is worth mentioning, we are in these studies talking about like less than 10% of, always less than 10% of respondents, right? Which is different than some studies that have shown, for example, at Brown, I believe 40% of students identify as LGBTQ+, right? So there's a lot of numbers here that, so.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought that was, we talked briefly yesterday and we both thought that was worth mentioning, and that would not have been known by these researchers that published this article. And yet, they sort of foreshadow it, that they're thinking, they just sort of say, oh, we have this mischievous respondents, and, they just sort of say, maybe it's overestimated because it's something to report about, these are, teenagers who are figuring out who they are. And it's something we all think we're so special, right? We're all special and unique, and no one else. I mean, when you're at that age and even into college, no one else has ever experienced the world or seen things the way that you have. You just really, you feel that way. Right. And so I don't think it's surprising that people are experimenting sexually and that kind of thing. But maybe the identification then as something else, another category, was just because you experimented with something, and so now it's like, oh yeah, I'll put that down, or something like you have some friends and you're just like kind of interested. It's like, what exactly is going on here? And so you say, oh yeah, I'm non-binary, or I'm not sure, or whatever. So I guess I'm not surprised that, that the numbers are going down. That we've talked a lot on this podcast in various times, not just you and me, but, of sort of the cachet of being, a potentially victimized group. Right. So there's sort of a little bit of martyrdom there and everything. So anyway, so they got rid of 2.7% of their sample, for various, reasons, various misbehavior kinds of reasons, and so they end up with still a very large sample size, and and they do find that. So I'm just going to go like let's see. I want table 4 here. The relationship between gender identity and perpetuating bullying. And so again, the best predictor, so that's table 4, the best predictor of bullying is being bullied. I mean, that's when we look down here, they categorize. So, I should mention this, that when they ask people about bullying, they translated into a 0-1 variable. So they asked people on a scale. So it was like many times a week, once a week, less frequently, or not at all. And so they took those responses and dichotomized them into, like basically less frequently or not at all. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. So like less frequently and not at all was a 0, basically. That's a 0. And then many times a week or once a week or more was a 1. And I don't know how I feel about the less frequently than once a week becoming a 0. I don't know how I feel about that. So and look, having analyzed data like this, like my suspicion is that they maybe don't admit it here, but what they might have done was played around with what are the best groupings. They might have done that. So I don't want to, and again, these people inherited this data, so I don't want to criticize them for that, because this data wasn't meant to be analyzed this way.
Right.
And so sometimes and so I'm not sure why they made that decision. They don't go into why they decided it that way. And I would have liked for them to have just explained it a little bit. But because they had then these groups, these yes, no, and then, the gender categories and everything, you had asked me yesterday about why do they do a chi-square and why are they doing this odds ratio? And it's really not complicated. The main reason is that they're not doing a correlation. Instead, they're doing this odds ratio. They're not doing a regression or a correlation. They're doing this odds ratio, and chi-square is because of the categorical nature of the data.
Oh, okay.
That's, so the data that you have drives the kind of analysis that you can do. So a chi-square helps you predict whether something, you can actually choose your predicted value. You can say, oh, is it more than 50%, more than 25%, that kind of thing. Or you can use the body of your data, which is what they did. They said, oh, well, you're going to use cisgender data to compare. And then is it happening more or less? Is it significantly different? Are the categories significantly different? Bullied, not bullied, for these different groups. And then in the odds ratio, it's like, sort of the odds ratio, as the odds ratio goes up, that value, whatever that variable is, like being transgender or being non-binary or whatever, is a better predictor. So the odds are more like that you would be bullied. So that's all it is. It's just a different way it's a way of analyzing dichotomized or trichotomized, data. Right. As opposed to, normally we would see regression or correlation, or we'd see an ANOVA, or something like that. So it's, so we start out with the odds ratio being the highest in table 4, just simply, if you've been bullied. So if you've been bullied, you're more like, so you actually start at the bottom of this table, and you can see it's like the odds ratio is like 8.9. And then it's even higher for the upper second, And so it's like, that's the best predictor. So we don't want to leave people with this impression from the podcast that being, gender nonconforming is like a really good predictor of being a bully.
Right.
It's not, it's really not.
No.
But when you compare it to cisgender, it's like, well, no, it's not like these people are saints because they're not gender nonconforming. They don't suddenly, become people who never engage in regular, teenage behavior. They still do things that, that we don't approve of, I guess, that are, they still bully people, So anyway, that was one of my takeaways, is that we need to sort of like remind people that we're not saying that, oh, those transgender people, they're a bullying sort. Well, really.
right. No, really. I think that was one of the strengths of the study was that they're like, they found it as equally the trans or gender nonconforming people are as much as likely to be the victim. Like, that's right. There's like, they're balancing off these two things here, right? Saying gender nonconforming people are bullied. I think one of the major thrusts of their study too, truthfully, is to really tease apart trans and non-binary. I don't know that. So, as you sort of talking about the iterative process of scholarship, right? The framing is just like you were talking about, how they may have used a binary 1-0 after seeing the data. The framing is the same way, right? I have a suspicion that there's an interest here in, and all that to say, I don't think, it does show up in the data, but I find myself wondering, were they trying to parcel out these communities, right? I find myself wondering, if that was, or not wondering if it's a motivation, but I guess it just doesn't seem as, it came out in the results anyways, but because that is something that even at the political level, at the more anecdotal level, at the level of work that I do, the qualitative sort of online, within the whole alphabet community, right, which now includes a lot of letters, and may, to some people's critique, sometimes my own, do something called forced teaming, right? Forcing sexualities with genders. Maybe those should be different camps, right? And without getting too deep into that, I do think that's one of the strengths of this is they were separating out some of the identities under the transgender umbrella, in this case, primarily non-binary, where again, the FIRE data has even more nuanced delineations. Such I keep saying genderqueer because it's the only one I can remember off the top. Or I think agender is also on there. So there's a much more nuanced take, but there are these delineations and demarcations. And in the FIRE data, and this goes to, I mean, I think it's worth talking about self-disclosure, self-declaration a little bit too. But in the FIRE data, the numbers are pretty high. The population samples that FIRE has had self-disclose as beyond gay and lesbian and trans, right? Genderqueer, the numbers are, they're not, it's not, 100,000 non-binary students, but Elizabeth and I had looked at the data months ago just for something else. And I had said to her, because I don't deal with numbers, I had thought I had added an order of magnitude. I was like, oh, it's 2,000. And I think in her head, she was like, Ryan doesn't know what he's talking about. It's probably 200. No, but she's like, it's probably, and then we pulled the data, and much to my surprise as well, I was like, wow, it is in excess of 2,000 or excess of 3,000, a number that just, it doesn't even almost seem possible. So again, this in one way I would like to say, and FIRE's data is available for anyone who asks for it. I should just mention that, right? Any researchers listening to this, the FIRE data sets are so valuable and so available. But all that to say, yeah, self-disclosure is interesting. It's not Kinsey, right? No one's testing to see, no one is testing to, with, I believe they do, like they put, a testing tool on someone's for men to see if they have erections, for example.
Right at the Kinsey, yeah.
Right, yeah. So so that, no one. Now we just ask people. But that's something that's changed. So the self ID or self disclosure or disclosure of one's labels is a part of these studies, I guess is what I'm trying to say. A long-winded way of saying that.
Yeah, and it is. Again, we can't fault the researcher for that because it's not their fault.
Absolutely.
And I also don't want to blame. I don't want to blame. It's like, all survey data is terrible, because that's not true either. But yeah. Look, one thing that I would have liked to have seen here, and since we're talking about the FIRE data, I'm looking at the FIRE data for something else, right? And so we have like 157,000 responses in one of the data sets. So that's like without the 2024 data, I think, in it. So the 2024 data is separate. And one of the things that we were looking at was those questions about allowing a speaker on campus. Okay. And so we were looking at lots of individual difference variables. Okay. And for example, like related to this, there was a question about, a speaker arguing that being gender non-conforming is a mental disorder. Okay, that's one of the speakers. Mm-hmm. And so, when it's asking people about, the appropriateness of that speaker for a college campus, and it also asks questions about how appropriate it is to obstruct the speech in various ways. Mm-hmm. So we then looked, let's say, for example, because it's relevant to this study, then we looked at those questions that you're talking about gender identification. And we looked to see whether that was relevant in whether somebody thought that speaker was appropriate or not, and whether it was appropriate to stop, okay, to prevent that speaker. And it's significant. There is a significant difference there, that people who are gender nonconforming think that speaker is more appropriate, and think that that the speaker should not be stopped, mm-hmm. Okay, to a higher extent. However, and that's significant because we have so many people in the study. When you look at, so basically, I think people's natural instinct is, more is better. But when you have really high numbers, like they do in this study that we're talking about, 130, almost 149,000, almost 140,000 people, everything is significant. Everything becomes significant because, and it's a mathematical thing, the denominator gets smaller, the numerator gets bigger, then you look up the number and it's significant. So it's just this very simple math thing. So we realized that everything we tested there was a significant difference. And we were like, okay, well, just because it's significant, is it meaningful? Like, are they responding in this, in a way that's, there's a significant difference. But I mean, for example, in the SAT, men score significantly higher on the SAT than women do. But we have hundreds of thousands of people who've taken this SAT, and you know what the average difference is? 2 questions. So it's a significant difference, but it's 2 questions.
Right.
And I don't think anybody would argue that 2 questions is a meaningful predictor of how you're going to do in college.
Right.
And so we started to think about that. And so what we did instead was we're reporting effect sizes. And effect sizes are a little bit better measure, well, a different measure that sort of help you figure out whether a relationship is, it's something different to compare about whether it's meaningful or not. And what we found over and over and over again, no matter what the topic was, that it's only political orientation that was a meaningful predictor. So although they're all significant, if you plot them, you see that they're all in a little, they're all jammed up. They're almost not, like visually when you plot it on, you realize like there's nothing to see here, folks.
Right.
Right. Except on political orientation.
Right.
So it wasn't, no matter what the question was, whether it was racial, Black Lives Matter is a hate group is one of the hypothetical speakers. Guess what? Race was not really, although there's a significant difference, it's not race that matters. It's political orientation when you look at effect size. I would have liked to have seen that in this data, that in this paper that we're talking about here. They did not report effect size, and I would have liked to have seen that. Because again, I think it's a little bit, it's like Kramer's V or something for chi-square. It's like, but it's not that hard to get. And I kind of wonder why they didn't do that, or why the editor, maybe like the journal, didn't ask them to do it. It's like, this is a minor point, but because the numbers are so big and these differences, even the odds ratios are still pretty small after you get to a certain point. Right. I just would have liked to have seen that. So I don't think there's any doubt that it mattered, that what they found is here. I'm not worried about that. I think, but, and they say like, and I think that you would agree, like this is the first time anybody's tried to do this.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, like I said, there's things in here that are balanced from even my perspective. Like some of the citations they use are people that I think, I'll just be frank, American scholars investigating this would refuse to cite this person because they're labeled transphobic, no questions asked. And I was surprised to see like a citation there from someone who I do happen to be pretty well acquainted with, both professionally and as a scholar and personally. And they seeing that citation, because like, we hear about citational justice. I'll be honest, unintentionally, I sort of study citational injustice instead of citing, I study people who are like toxic to cite, for example, right? That's within my wheelhouse of cancel culture and academic cancel culture. And so I just, there's some, that was something that I was really happy with this. Yeah, no, I think I was very happy with it. The paper is very interesting. And though I think your point about effect size is, it would be good to know. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And, and I'm sure, again, this is, it's maybe not a public available data set to us because we're not in Finland, but, somebody could go back and look at these things. So, I thought that, again, I thought this study was really interesting. And I honestly, even though, it's about, non-conforming people, it really is about bullying. It really is. And I think that the general finding that the bullied are bullies, I think is important and relevant, across all groups, across time. And was an important, I think that they appropriately focused on that also. And really talked about, they really did a good job, I thought, about talking about what might be going on there.
And so I want to sort of add to that and then turn it to the side a little bit. Yeah, my interest, I mean, I am happy we learned this about these populations, and I have no interest in demonizing either one or presuming they're bullies. I think why this is interesting in light of the recent Kaufman data is if someone is identifying as non-binary but is not actually non-binary but was bullying people, like there's another layer here. And sorry, I will openly admit this is flagrantly political to me as a gay man. I guess I should say that's my bias here, right? Is what while sexuality and gender are probably separate, maybe they should be, whatever that conversation. And I take into account, I should say, Elizabeth is much kinder than me, which you can tell if you've been listening. I take into account the point that these are high school students, middle school students, and then the Kaufman data, college students, right? These are all people that are, I'm not that age, right? But there is something, there's something that doesn't sit great with me that not only may people kind of be putting on identities to other people. I mean, I don't want to this isn't a conversation about Rachel Dolezal, right? But like, there's something here about, and in less kind ways in public research before, I've called this a form of minstrelsy. I have to be honest about that. And so, like I said, Elizabeth keeps me on the straight and narrow. But that is why this is important, right? I think there are larger ramifications here, even if it is important to learn about these populations, and I'm glad they focused. And I feel like I'm glad they focused, again, on both sides. They are not saying, nor are we, gender non-conforming people are bullies. No, that is an interesting finding, but it's only in the context of probably because they were bullied, right? Which Elizabeth helpfully has put in the larger psychological literature, which also is not my background. I appreciate her adding that helps me sort of think through this. But the larger thing about sort of, and she mentioned this earlier, about sort of the accrual of status in victimhood. That's what I think is one of the interesting through lines here. And I make this point, and this is sort of how I save myself from being canceled, perhaps. I make this point because it is difficult to be trans. I'm not, but I know that makes a difficult life. And so if there are people that are sort of, it's one thing, I understand, you may not know all the things about yourself. Things change. I understand that, but to sort of to pretend to be trans, I don't know how else to say this, to pretend to be trans or pretend to be non-binary, there's, damage is done outside. I don't know if that's, I don't know. That was a little polemical. I apologize, but there's a lot going on here, I think. And it's so disingenuous just to say, oh, and this was transphobic, right? No, that's the study. I don't think the study is transphobic. And I don't think, I think it's important to talk about these things. And I think they matter for literally the rights of trans people and the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. We all live in society together, right? So that's my polemic for the the paper.
Well, and I often wonder to myself, like, for example, let's just say that sometimes I just want to insert into a study race. Would this paper have been published if they found that racial minorities were discriminated against and engaged in discrimination? And I don't know that it would have. And so I'm glad that this paper got published, and I'm surprised in some ways, as you are, that this paper got published, right? And it's like when you insert race in here and you think, no, we can't go there yet, right? Yeah. We can't go there yet. And there are papers that were published, even 10 years ago that couldn't get published now. 15, 20 years ago that couldn't get published now, that led to advances for minority groups because that research could be done and published. Right. And I think that, this kind of research, it's not harmful to minority groups. It's helpful, right? Because these are the kinds of things that we need to learn about and talk about in order that everyone thrives.
Absolutely.
Right? We can't have, a classroom discussion if we have people in the classroom who are torturing one another, right? And so how do we, and bullying has been this huge topic for years in schools. And if we don't find out more about, about bullying and who's not just like, oh, that's that person's a bully. They'll be a bully their whole life.
Right.
We'll just, socially isolate that person now because they're a bully. So we're getting down to a pretty like narrow group of people who don't have anything wrong with them now. It's like we got to figure out how to live in this world, and how to have a classroom, how to have students move about and change classes without knocking each other over and doing that. And so anything that advances the ball in that way is good. And I think that and I know that you were worried about talking about this study, and whether it might get, mostly you, not me. I'm not on social media, so I've already been canceled, in a very ugly way. So stay off all that stuff. But I mean, for doing research, that scared some people, and I just saw, as a matter of fact, a study, somebody who supported me. So my research was about, or my students' research, it wasn't mine, but had asked a question about Black Lives Matter. And because for anybody who's listening and not watching, I don't have dark skin, so I was not allowed to supervise that research. But somebody who had supported me posted about a study for COVID where they were asking about how to convince people, what's the best language to convince people to get vaccinated. And so that person who defended my research criticized the vaccine research because they said that research isn't improving people's health. It's about how to make them take the COVID vaccine. And it's like, no, it's a researcher who's interested in language and persuasion, right? Who used COVID vaccines as an example for how to use language to convince people to get medical services, right? So the vaccine was it could have been a flu vaccine, it could have been cancer treatments, it could have been anything, okay? But they used a contemporary problem to describe it. And so anything can be twisted around to no longer be a social science study, right? To be a motivated study, to be, it's like, oh, you were motivated to make Black Lives Matter look bad. You were motivated to make COVID vaccines look good or whatever. But really, as social scientists, as these authors that we're looking at it's like, no, we're just interested in contemporary, human behavior and challenges. And this gender non-conforming is, a hot topic. It's a challenge that we all need to know about. We need to know about, how one of the biggest social movements in the last 10 years, Black Lives Matter, impacts people. We need to know about, COVID vaccines. We need to know about gender nonconformity. But the real thing we want to know about is bullying. Right? And the real thing we want to know about in terms of like COVID vaccine is just persuasion, persuasive techniques, persuasive language. And the real thing we want to know about with Black Lives Matter is the way that people get motivated to engage in social, activism. And so yes, this study is about, gender nonconformity and bullying, but that's because they were interested in bullying, not because they were trying to go after. And I think that a lot of times people just miss that. They're not thinking like a scientist. They're thinking about a motivated consumer of scientific literature, and they interpret it.
I also have to say, just because on the ground, because of my own research, I find it hard to believe a motivated attack on gender nonconforming people is being published in a top tier journal at the moment. I only say that because I actually can't. I would have known in the last 5 years if that happened. I know the outlets were people who want to publish work that is accused of being transphobic. The few that they publish in, and this, I can't off the top of my head think of a top tier, in my discipline, my home discipline, or any, So yeah, I mean, but it is a moment of an indication of our times that it is easy to turn even this conversation that way, right?
And they do put transgender identity in their title.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it was a bold move on the author's part. It was a bold move on Frontier's part, and I applaud them all.
Yeah.
So.
And the paper was fair. The best part being, right, the paper is fair, right? That's, this paper mattered to me because I feel like it really taught me something to think relationally in a way I wouldn't have otherwise. Right. Again, someone who's not trained in psychology, so it was valuable. It was very valuable to me to help me think differently about and I study the conflict side of this with gender and academia and sex and gender nonconformity. So this was for me, this was helpful in my toolkit of how to think about these things. So in sort of what you just described, the paper taught me something as a consumer of this, who of course has my own biases, aggressive biases in this issue because I've studied it long enough. You know what I mean? So yeah, no, I think it was great.
Well, thank you for coming to talk to me about this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. This is great. I love ILV and the dissidents. It's great.
Well, just for the people who listen, I've coerced Ryan into maybe coming and talking to us about once a month or so.
Absolutely.
So watch for Ryan and Elizabeth again. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.